Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside Europe's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter and I will be your host for today's show. We've got an interesting show today. We're going to be talking about, does your board culture promote risk-factored growth and innovation? And joining me is someone who certainly has experienced this through their career. Please welcome Andy Green, who's the chairman of IG Group, is also the non-executive director for Airtel Africa, and also serves on the board of Link Administrations Holding in Australia. Welcome, Andy.
Thank you.
That's a lot of traveling to keep up with everything, but it's a pleasure that you took the time to join us. So I think the best place for us to start is for you to, if you could, just quickly review what your boards do and any committees that you serve on relative to those boards.
Yeah, so look, I'm chair of IG, therefore I chair the nomination committee. It's fairly normal in the UK, and I attend all the other meetings. I'm allowed to be I'm actually a member of the remuneration committee as well. At Airtel Africa, I'm a member of the audit committee, and I've served on the audit committee at Arm Holdings before we sold it as well, so I've been frequently on remuneration audit committees. And I chair a European advisory forum for Link. They bought a big business here in Europe, and that's when I joined the board.
So we want to talk about the culture, particularly as it relates to innovation. And I sense that boards are a little sheepish on sort of getting the company versus doing what's right for the company versus answering sort of what I call noisy shareholders who have some agendas that they'd like to make sure. So sort of how do you see the environment, and how does the board get the right balance between sort of what's right for they feel what's right for the company and sort of the shareholder pressure that seems to be growing all the time?
You know, it's really interesting. I spent 20 years of my career at BT, and we used to talk about culture all the time, but we were concerned to sort of move on from a civil service culture and create an innovative and growth-oriented culture, and to change that enormous strength, but keeping the good bits, but really trying to build that commerciality into the business. As my career's developed, the conversation in the boardroom about culture seemed to be almost entirely defensive, and I think it's driven by regulation. I think, you know, that most of the cultural conversations that come up are about, have we got the right culture on conduct risk in financial services, for example? You know, we've seen the big scandals in the US and Europe about mis-selling and those sort of things, very high costs. Do we have the right data, you know, the right views about the way we protect consumers' data, about information security? Do we have people who are really up about? So you have lots of cultural conversations which are very defensive, it seems to me. They're all about how do we protect ourselves against regulation. And shareholders, when they assess and discuss culture with you, are very much driven by the fact that they've been pushed really by regulators, particularly in the UK, into sort of taking a more active role. And so particularly the governance specialists who look after the index funds, you know, look at those cultural questions as well, not from a particularly rounded point of view, I think. So I think the challenge is, how do you create a culture that maximizes sustainable long-term growth and shareholder value? And it seems to me it's that word sustainable that pulls together the defensive and the offensive part of cultural conversation. That, you know, what we don't want is such an entrepreneurial culture that we make lots of money for 6 months and then we run into a problem with our data regulator or with the financial regulator or somebody else. We want something that is creating a sustainable business that's in tune with society and is bringing those defensive cultures, but it starts with the concept of growth and innovation.
So those comments are a good segue because, you know, I remember all the phrases like, if you don't take risks, you're not going to grow, or if you don't innovate, companies disappear. At the same time, the challenge with public companies is those quarterly reporting. If you miss a whispered number, your stock takes a hit. So it puts you in a situation, you want employees, when they innovate, to have the freedom to fail, okay, or else they're not going to take those chances. But if you have a bad quarter, nobody's thinking long term. I mean, I think that's one of the challenges today.
I think boards have to be really robust and defend the fact that they're there to work with the executive to manage the company well. I think that the tendency is that people will be driven by those quarterly results and therefore not prepared to invest in change. And in particularly in this digital world, if you're not prepared to be on the front foot on that, make all the right moves, then I think you can quickly get into a situation where you have an all bricks and mortar business that's not succeeding. The other thing I think that's happening is that the sort of sense that if 20% of shareholders vote against you, you've done something bad. Now the problem with that is, what happens if 60% really like what you're doing and 20% really don't like it and 20% are kind of in the middle? By definition, you're going to make boards less prepared to take risk, less prepared to drive the changes at the moment they think. They'll be waiting and waiting until it's completely obvious to everybody that the change needs to happen if we're not careful. And therefore I think boards have to take a very high responsibility, firstly for deciding what is right for the long-term sustainable growth of the company, and secondly for communicating that well to shareholders. And sometimes that's really difficult. I mean, this remuneration question is really difficult, whether boards can really do anything to really drive performance through remuneration anymore with the various views of the different large-scale investors in the marketplace is very unsure to me. But I think in the end we have to kind of be very robust about doing the right thing for the company and then trying to manage the rest of it through, and sometimes facing up to small-scale rebellions, because otherwise I fear companies will get pushed back into sort of not doing things when they really need to be done.
So that communication about long-term and expressing that importance in your chairman role for the one company, doesn't that sort of put you in the position to be on an shareholder engagement, for example, to really show the confidence of why you're following that path?
It does. I mean, it's absolutely more and more important, I think, that we communicate not only with the active shareholders, which we're used to doing, but also with the big governance teams in the passive shareholders, because they're a big part of it, and I think it's really important. I mean, I think we have to be robust about it. It's quite difficult. It's fine if you're Shell or BP or something very big, you'll always get an audience. For us running around in the FTSE 250, it's a bit more difficult to get an audience, and I think that means sometimes there is a danger that people will feel their personal reputation is at stake if they haven't quite got it over, even when they're confident they're doing the right thing. So I'm really concerned that we retake control in the boardroom, and we stop spending all our time believing we have to get everything right, take a decision about the right thing to do, and then communicate in whatever way we can to get the right thing done. Otherwise, I fear that some of our companies will end up very passively managed in the boardroom.
Yeah. So we got about 3 minutes left. If you had to give 3 guidelines, that a board should remember, things that they should remember when they're discussing culture and innovation in the boardroom, what little tidbits would you pass along to our audience?
I'd say three things, simple things. One of which is work through the balance between your defensive culture, the things that keep you out of trouble and your offensive culture, the things that drive the innovation and growth, and balance that together into the culture you're trying to, the target culture you're trying to get to. Work that through with the executive, really think about it in terms of how you create this sustainable company. It seems to me creating sustainable growth and sustainable profitability is what ties the defensive and the offensive culture together. Secondly, I'd say remember that everybody says you're responsible for the culture, but the culture exists. In any sizable company, there is a culture, right? You're responsible for helping the executive move from where the culture is to the target culture you set, in my view. It's all very well saying you're responsible for the culture, but it takes time to move culture. So you're responsible for the journey, in my view, in the cultural change. And the third thing is, remember that you have more information, you have better colleagues around the table who spend more time thinking about it. You've created the diversity of thought around the boardroom. You've got to be prepared, along with your executive colleagues, to set out the agenda and go and sell that to shareholders and not be too frightened of all this shareholder activism.
Yeah. Well, Andy, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Pleasure.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside Europe's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again with another critical issue that'll help you be a better board member and committee member. So we'll see you then.